In September of 1995, a 35,000-word manifesto arrived at major U.S. newspapers with an outrageous demand: publish it, or the bombings will continue. For nearly 2 decades, a mysterious figure known only as Unabomber had terrorized the country. His homemade bombs, targeted at universities, airlines, and scientists, had already killed 3 people and injured over 20 others. The FBI had launched the largest and most expensive manhunt in United States history, yet the bomber remained a ghost. When he was finally caught, the truth stunned the nation. The man behind the attacks wasn't a career criminal. He was a former mathematics prodigy, a child genius who entered Harvard University at just 16 years old with a brilliant academic career in front of him. So how does a gifted scholar end up in a one-room cabin in the Montana wilderness? How does a brilliant mind become a domestic terrorist? And what happens when extraordinary intelligence fuses with isolation, resentment, and the belief that modern science is an enemy? My name is Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the darkness finally meets the light. This is the story of Ted Kaczynski, and it isn't just about a bomber. It's an exploration of technology, alienation, and the dangerous consequences of believing that violence is the only way to make the world listen. To understand Ted Kaczynski, we have to start long before the bombs, the manifesto, or that Montana cabin. Born on May 22, 1942 in Chicago to working-class parents Wanda and Theodore, Ted's early childhood was completely ordinary. But one infancy event would later take on an almost mythical significance. When Ted was just 9 months old, a severe case of hives put him in the hospital for several days. And because hospital policies at the time limited parental visits, he was isolated from his family. When he returned home, his mother and brother noticed a dramatic shift. The once happy baby was now withdrawn, cold and unresponsive. While it's impossible to know the true psychological impact on an infant, many biographers point to this early trauma as the root of Ted's emotional detachment. What we do know for certain, though, was that Ted was a prodigy and at a very young age. He consistently outperformed his peers, and school officials responded the way that many gifted children were treated in the mid-20th century. They accelerated him. He skipped both 6th and 11th grades, and he raced through the school system. On paper, this was a success story, but in reality, his gift isolated him. Being younger, smaller, and intellectually light years ahead of everyone else made it impossible for him to fit in. Classmates saw him as awkward. He saw them as a completely different species. While adults celebrated his brilliance, Ted spent his youth as an outsider. That very intelligence that had opened all of these academic doors was building social walls, a pattern that would define the rest of his life. In 1958, at just 16 years old, Ted left home for Harvard University. For most families, an Ivy League admission is a dream come true for a child. For Ted, however, it was the start of an even deeper, echoing isolation. While intellectually brilliant, he was emotionally still a child among young adults. He couldn't form friendships, couldn't relate to his now much older peers, and the loneliness that had tracked him since childhood only deepened. It was during this vulnerable period that Kaczynski volunteered for a series of brutal psychological experiments run by Dr. Henry Murray. The study was designed to break a person's psychological defenses under extreme stress. First, students were asked to write detailed essays outlining their deepest personal beliefs and their philosophies. Then they were strapped to a chair, hooked up to electrodes, and subjected to savage, highly personal attacks by a trained interrogator who used those prior essays against them. These sessions were all filmed, and the young participants were forced to watch footage of their own humiliation over and over again. Because of Kaczynski's later crimes, these experiments have sparked massive speculation. It's easy to look at the systemic psychological abuse and draw a line to the Unabomber. But historians and psychologists caution against that. Thousands of people endure severe trauma without ever becoming domestic terrorists. So we don't want to make the connection that this event created who Ted became, but it definitely did contribute. What these experiments did was confirm all of Ted's worst fears. They took a teenager who already felt deeply alienated and distrustful and proved to him that the establishment was an enemy that was out to destroy his mind. So after Harvard, Ted's life seemed locked into the predictable arc of elite academics. He moved on to the University of Michigan, where his mathematical talent became undeniable. And at just 25 years old, he earned his PhD. He produced brilliant work in a branch of geometry so complex that only a handful of scholars in the country could even understand what he was doing. His trajectory was honestly breathtaking. In 1967, the University of California, Berkeley, home to one of the most competitive math departments in the world, hired him as an assistant professor. He was one of the youngest faculty members in the university's history. But beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to widen. Kaczynski despised the environment. He did not enjoy working at a college. He was deeply uncomfortable with the social expectations of his job, and he grew to hate the very modern institution where he was excelling. Colleagues noted he was cold, distant, and completely disengaged from the social fabric of campus life. He didn't want to teach, and he didn't even really want to participate in the college experience. Not as a student or as a teacher, honestly. Then in 1969, he made a decision that stunned the academic community. At the absolute peak of his very promising career, he resigned. There was no backup plan, no transition to another university, and no explanation given to any of his baffled colleagues or bosses. He wasn't just quitting his job, he was divorcing himself from civilization. He packed everything he owned and turned his back on research, cities, and modern life entirely. The path that began with mathematical brilliance was now taking a radical turn directly into the wilderness. Now, after walking away from Berkeley, Ted Kaczynski didn't look for another job. Instead, he looked for an escape route. In 1971, he bought a tiny plot of land just outside of Lincoln, Montana, a remote town hemmed in by dense forests and rugged mountains. The wilderness offered him the one thing he craved above everything else: distance. Distance from society. There, using very basic tools and salvaged timber, he built a one-room wooden cabin. It was just 12 by 10 feet, had no electricity, no running water, and no modern conveniences. He grew his own vegetables, he hunted game in the woods, and he learned to live entirely off the grid, transforming himself from an academic elite into a backwoods survivalist. At first, this was a retreat, but as the years began to bleed together, his isolation turned into obsession. The sanctuary he had chosen wasn't safe from the outside world, and industrial progress was creeping closer and closer. Logging operations began chewing through the nearby forests. Roads cut through areas that he considered sacred, and the roar of heavy machinery shattered the silence that he had sacrificed everything to find. For Kaczynski, this wasn't just an environmental nuisance. It was a profound psychological assault. He watched the wilderness that he loved systemically consumed by technological advancement, and his frustration grew rapidly into a dark, unyielding ideology. In his mind, the enemy wasn't a specific logging company or even a bad policy. The enemy was the entire trajectory of modern industrial civilization. He started to believe that technology itself was a monster designed to destroy human autonomy and crush the natural world. What had started as just a simple retreat in the woods had now fully transformed into a radical worldview. In Ted Kaczynski's mind, modern society could not be reasoned with, and it could not be reformed. It had to be stopped. And inside that dark, cramped cabin, a far more dangerous path started to take shape. By 1978, Ted Kaczynski's private rage broke out of his journals and into the physical world. That May, a suspicious package was found in a parking lot at Northwestern University. It was addressed to a professor, but when campus security opened it, the device detonated. This was the opening shot of a 2-decade terror campaign. over the next 7 years, homemade bombs appeared across the country. The targets were always very specific: universities, research centers, anyone tied to science, engineering, or technology. And soon the bomber began to escalate, targeting commercial airlines. In 1979, a bomb inside of a cargo hold of an American Airlines flight started smoking mid flight and nearly bringing down the entire plane. With public fear starting to explode, the FBI launched a massive task force. They dubbed the unknown attacker Unabomber, standing for University and Airline Bomber. What drove the investigators crazy, though, wasn't just that this was unpredictable geography, but the craftsmanship of these weapons. It was terrifying. They were used to crude pipe bombs, but these were meticulously handcrafted, made out of wood, hand-carved switches, customized metal pipes. Kaczynski built his own triggers and mixed his own gunpowder from scratch. More frustrating still was the obsessive attention to forensics. He spent hours scraping off the tool markings. He used salvaged scraps of metal that couldn't be traced to any store. He even hand-delivered or mailed packages from random cities to throw them off of his trail. He left absolutely no fingerprints, no DNA, and no clues. He really was a ghost. By 1985, his signature emerged. Hidden inside the framework of a bomb sent to a Boeing executive, investigators found 2 letters stamped in the metal: FC. It stood for Freedom Club, but they wouldn't figure out what it meant for years to come. What they did understand, though, was that this wasn't random violence. It was calculated, lethal, and designed to force the world to look at the monster in the woods. By the mid-1980s, the Unabomber campaign was not sporadic or experimental at this point. The bomber had perfected his craft. His confidence was surging, and his devices were becoming exponentially more lethal. Then came December 11th, 1985. In Sacramento, California, 38-year-old Hugh Scruton was opening up his computer rental store. It was the height of the early personal computer boom, and Scruton was a well-liked local businessman. He was helping ordinary people navigate this very exciting new technological frontier. That morning, Scruton noticed a strange package in the parking lot behind his shop, a wooden block full of nails. When he moved it, the device detonated with such force, it sent shrapnel tearing through his chest. Hugh died almost instantly. He was the first person to lose his life to the Unabomber, and the murder sent shockwaves through his community. Scruton wasn't a high-profile tech mogul or a government scientist. He was just an ordinary guy trying to run a business. In an instant, the optimistic world of early computer culture was shattered by this terrifying reality. Someone out there was willing to murder everyday people if they participated in modern society. For the FBI, Scruton's death changed everything. This was no longer just property damage or small injuries. The ghost had finally crossed the line. The Unabomber case was now a hunt for a cold-blooded killer. Between the murder of Hugh Scruton in 1985 and the next fatal attack almost a decade later, the Unabomber case entered an agonizing quiet phase. It went dark. 6 years. Silence that drove investigators to the brink of madness. The FBI task force had swollen into this bureaucratic monster. They were chasing thousands of leads across the country, that they were no closer to an identity. Then in February of 1987, they actually got a break. In Salt Lake City, Utah, a computer store employee looked out a window and saw a man in the parking lot dropping off a wooden crown of thorns wrapped in cloth. When she called out to him, he turned. From her description, a forensic artist drew what will become the defining image of modern American terror: a man in a hooded sweatshirt and aviator sunglasses. For the first time, the faceless bomber had a face. And the sketch would be plastered across front pages and evening news broadcasts nationwide. But instead of breaking the case open, the sketch led to a dead end. And then the bomber went dark. From 87 to 93, no packages arrived. No bombs detonated. Investigators were left with pretty haunting questions. Had the bomber accidentally blown himself up? Had he been locked up for another crime? Was he satisfied? Had he made his point? The truth was actually worse. In that Montana cabin, Ted Kaczynski didn't stop. He was refining his chemistry. He was building bigger, more sophisticated, and more unstable bombs. In June of 1993, the silence ended. Within just 2 days, there were two devastating bombs detonated on opposite sides of the country, targeting twin pillars of the high-tech future that Ted despised. The first was June 22nd at the California home of Dr. Charles Epstein, a world-renowned geneticist whose work on Down syndrome had actually saved many lives. The blast tore through his kitchen, costing him 3 of his fingers. Exactly 48 hours later, across the country at Yale University, a second bomb almost killed Dr. David Galertner, a visionary computer science professor. Dr. Galertner was forced to crawl through blinding smoke and down 5 flights of stairs to survive, permanently losing the use of his right hand. The Unabomber was back. He was angrier, his technology was more lethal, and the calendar flipped to 1994. He was ready to go after new victims. On December 10th, 1994, a package arrived at North Caldwell, New Jersey, the home of Thomas J. Mosser. Mosser was a high-powered advertising executive in New York City, a man whose career was embedded in the fast-paced corporate culture of the late 20th century. That Saturday morning, surrounded by his family, Mosser opened a package. The device detonated with catastrophic force. It killed him instantly. Mosser's death marked a horrifying escalation. For nearly 2 decades, Kaczynski had struck universities, corporate offices, scientists. But this time, he had sent a bomb to a private residence. He collapsed the boundary between public targets and personal sanctuary. The message was unmistakable. No one was safe, not even in your own living room. To the public, Mosser became a headline. To his colleagues, he was a brilliant communications strategist. And to those who loved him, he was a husband and a father whose life was violently stolen just weeks before Christmas. His family was left to process a devastating loss while being thrust into the spotlight of this national manhunt. Later, investigators would learn the chilling reason that Kaczynski had chosen him. In his journals, he wrote that he targeted Mosser's public relations firm because he believed that they were helping the big corporations manipulate public opinion and continue to destroy the environment. Thomas Mosser was murdered for just doing his job, and his tragic death injected an urgency into the FBI task force. The clock was starting to tick, louder than ever, and the ghost in the woods was getting ruthless. On April 24th, 1995, the final lethal bomb of the Unabomber campaign arrived at the headquarters of the California Forestry Association in Sacramento. It was addressed to the group's former president, but it was opened instead by 47-year-old Gilbert Brent Murray, a prominent timber industry lobbyist. The bomb exploded, completely destroying the entire office. It was staggering, the amount of destruction. Gilbert was killed instantly. This attack struck at the very heart of the obsession that was consuming Ted Kaczynski. For years, he had watched those logging trucks rumble past his retreat, chewing up the forest that he considered to be sacred. In his twisted ideological framework, Murray wasn't a human being, he was a symbol. He represented the physical destruction of nature, the commercialization of the wilderness, and the expansion of the industrial machine. But Gilbert Murray was far from an abstraction. He was the father of 2, a husband, widely respected executive, known for actually being warm and very dedicated. He was a man who loved the outdoors himself, and he was murdered by a radical extremist who claimed to be protecting the same outdoors. Murray's death became the grim finish line of a 17-year bombing campaign. Kaczynski had made his point through blood and terror, and his next move would actually pivot away from hidden packages. Just a few months after Murray's murder, the Unabomber would issue his ultimatum: publish this manifesto or I will keep killing people. By the summer of 1995, the Unabomber had moved out of true crime files and really into American psyche. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a phantom, a low-grade background radiation of just anxiety that was running through citizens. 17 years, 16 bombs, 23 maimed, and 3 dead. Despite the thousands of leads and decades of work, the FBI task force was lost. Kaczynski had left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, no digital footprint. He was a shadow who slipped out of the woods, dropped death into a mailbox, and then vanished into the mist. For ordinary citizens, the fear was intimate and quiet. The Postal Service, a system built on trust and connection, had been weaponized. American citizens looked at everyday packages with paralyzing suspicion. A simple brown paper parcel on a porch was not just a delivery anymore. This was a potential execution device. The FBI was exhausted. The public was terrified. The investigation had hit a wall. And it was exactly in this climate, this total gridlock, that the attacker himself made a catastrophic mistake. He got impatient. He wanted his ideals to outlive the crimes. So in the late summer of 1995, a massive, closely typed manuscript landed on the desk of all of the nation's biggest editors. The Ghost in the Woods was ready to speak. And that single document would completely shatter the mystery, bringing the longest, most frustrating manhunt in American history to an end. In June of 1995, that manuscript landed on the desk of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and accompanying it was a pretty ruthless ultimatum. Publish all 35,000 words of this document in full, or a heavily loaded airliner will be blown out of the sky. The essay was called Industrial Society and Its Future, and at its core was a pretty radical dark philosophy. Modern technology is not a neutral tool of progress, but an all-consuming monster designed to strip human beings of their freedom, autonomy, and psychological well-being. Kaczynski argued that modern civilization could not be reformed or voted out of power. It had to be completely destroyed, forcing humanity into a total collapse back to the pre-industrial survival era. The demand actually ignited a fierce, unprecedented ethical war behind the scenes. The Attorney General, Janet Reno, and the FBI Director, Louis Freeh, huddled with newspaper publishers in secret meetings, and the dilemma was agonizing for them. If they refused, innocent people would die. But if they capitulated, they were handing a national megaphone to a cold-blooded serial killer, setting a terrifying precedent that terrorism could buy front-page real estate in any newspaper. Ultimately, the FBI made a desperate and calculated gamble. They gave the green light to publish, but they weren't doing it to appease him. They were hoping that if they cast this massive net across America, someone, somewhere, might recognize this manifesto. And on September 19th, 1995, the Washington Post printed the manifesto as a special insert. Ted Kaczynski got exactly what he wanted. Millions of America reading his words. He believed he had won. But his arrogance blinded him. Because sitting at a kitchen table over 700 miles away, a man was opening that newspaper. And he was about to recognize a voice he had heard his entire life. When Industrial Society and Its Future hit the newsstands, millions of people actually read it. Some of it was just morbid curiosity. But in a quiet home in Schenectady, New York, it landed with a devastating, sickening weight. The realization didn't start with David Kaczynski. It started with his wife, Linda Patrick. For years, David had been sharing all of his old letters from his brilliant and estranged older brother. He would describe Ted's radical hatred of modern society to his wife. And when the manifesto was published, Linda took it to her husband and said, "You need to read this." David was skeptical. He loved his brother, and the idea that Ted could be a serial killer seemed absurd. But as David began to read the manifesto, the skepticism dissolved into just pure horror. This wasn't just the anti-technology philosophy. It was the rhythm of Ted's prose, the rigid, hyper-logical sentence structures. It matched the letters that the two had shared almost identically. Ted had a highly unique habit of using very archaic phrases, like writing, "You can't eat your cake and have it too," rather than the reversal, which is, "You can't have your cake and eat it too." There in the newsprint was that exact phrase, said wrong, the way Ted had been always saying it wrong their entire lives. It was unmistakable and a haunting echo of his big brother's voice. David and Linda were caught in a hellish moral trap. If they were wrong, they might destroy an innocent man's life. But if they were right and they were quiet, the next mail bomb would have their brother's return address written in innocent blood. Driven by his conscience, David made the choice to contact the FBI through an intermediary. It was an agonizing and very difficult choice for him. Not out of malice, but he knew that he needed to save people. And he explicitly extracted a promise from federal prosecutors that they would seek psychological help for Ted rather than just immediately jumping to the death penalty. Ultimately, 17 years of high-tech forensics, profiling, and millions of dollars hadn't cracked the Unabomber case. It was broken by a wife's intuition and a brother's broken heart. In the spring of 1996, the longest and most expensive manhunt in FBI history surged toward a final dramatic conclusion. Armed with David Kaczynski's tips and linguistic analysis that matched the manifesto perfectly, federal agents quietly flooded the mountains of Lincoln, Montana. They didn't storm the property with flashbangs or SWAT gear. They knew that Ted's cabin was a potential minefield, likely rigged with tripwires and explosives. They had to figure out a way to lure him out into the open. On April 3rd, 1996, a local forest ranger who Ted knew and trusted walked up to the cabin door. He knocked, telling Ted he needed help looking at a property map. The door creaked open, and a disheveled, heavily bearded man stepped out into the mountain air, and in an instant, hidden federal agents lunged forward, pinned him in the dirt. After 17 years, Ted Kaczynski was in handcuffs. But the true horror of the Unabomber story was inside that tiny 10 by 12-foot wooden shack. When the agents crossed the threshold, they stepped into the mind of a monster. The space was claustrophobic and filthy, packed with over 40,000 pages of meticulous handwritten journals detailing his hatred, his surveillance of all of his victims, and just pure malice. Shelved right next to these philosophical writings were jars of chemicals, hand-carved wooden triggers, raw bomb-making components. And most terrifying of all, wrapped in a blanket under his bed, agents found a fully constructed live mail bomb already stamped and addressed and ready to be nailed to the next victim. If David and Linda hadn't spoken up when they did, someone else would have died. The raid on the Montana cabin ended that 2-decade reign of terror. The anonymous phantom known only as Unabomber was gone, and in his place stood a broken, isolated man, surrounded by the physical wreckage of his own genius and rage. The darkness had finally met the light. The arrest of Ted Kaczynski didn't end the battle, though. It just shifted the war from Montana wilderness to a federal courtroom. And the first person Kaczynski went to war with was his own lawyer. As the government prepared to seek the death penalty, Ted's lawyers realized the only hope of saving his life was the mental defect defense. They wanted to argue that he had suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. But Ted Kaczynski was not having it. He rejected this idea with absolute fury. In his mind, a diagnosis of insanity was worse than the death penalty. If the world decided he was just a broken, sick man, then that manifesto was worthless, just the ramblings of a lunatic rather than the brilliant philosophy of a revolutionary. And that's what he thought he was, a revolutionary. He fought desperately to fire his lawyers and represent himself, preferring lethal injection over a psychiatric label. The prosecution decided that ideally they did not want to go to trial because it was going to be a chaotic ideological circus. So they offered Ted a deal in 1998. Kaczynski pled guilty to all charges. In exchange, the government would take the death penalty off the table. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole and sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, aka the Alcatraz of the Rockies. There is a profound, haunting irony to his final decades. The man who had sacrificed everything to escape modern infrastructure was locked inside of a concrete cage under 23-hour-a-day surveillance, entirely dependent on the very technology, electricity, and automated systems he had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. For 25 years, he remained in that high-tech tomb, writing letters to an undercurrent of very radical followers until June of 2023. He died in a federal prison medical facility at the age of 81. Ted Kaczynski's life moved from the peak of mathematical brilliance to the depths of ideological isolation, and finally, to a permanent state-controlled silence. He wanted to force the world to destroy its walls, but in the end, his own hatred built a cage he couldn't get out of. Ted Kaczynski's legacy rarely produces easy answers. He is remembered first and foremost as a domestic terrorist who ran a 17-year campaign of calculated murder. That reality must anchor to every discussion of his life. Yet his story persists because part of his manifesto feels unsettlingly prophetic. In a world dominated by artificial intelligence, data harvesting, predictive algorithms, and total digital dependence, the mainstream anxieties of 2026 kind of sound like Ted Kaczynski's nightmares in 1995. But the prophetic insight is not a justification for murder. The terrifying lesson of the Unabomber is what happens when legitimate anxieties fuse with narcissism and isolation. Kaczynski's moral reasoning collapsed into a belief that complex human systems could be reduced to a single enemy, and that only fire and blood could make any change. He believed he was saving the world from progress, from itself. But belief, no matter how fiercely held, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It leaves a trail of fractured families, shattered bodies, and rewritten history. And in the end, the truth always leaves a trail. In this case, that trail ran through bleeding bomb sites, unyielding journals, through a printed manifesto, and right back to a tiny, silent wooden cabin in the Montana woods where Ted Kaczynski had tried to disappear from the earth entirely. He spent his life trying to outrun the modern world, only to spend his last 25 years trapped by it. My name is Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. Ideas can shape our world, but when they are weaponized by isolation and violence, they don't just challenge systems. They destroy human lives. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. If you found the story of the Unabomber unsettling, I want you to tune in next week. We're going somewhere completely different, deep into the heart of New York City's ballroom culture of history, identity, and secrecy. Next week, we're covering drag legend Dorian Corey and the shocking true crime secret she kept hidden in her closet for over 30 years. See you next week.